Okay, you should be all set. Bill, I made you a co-host so you can start your presentation whenever you guys are ready.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. Looks like we've got 7 members. We'll give it another minute or so before we start. That's all right with everybody? All right. It is 9:02. I'd like to call this morning's meeting of the Commission on Judicial Compensation to order. Excuse me. I'd like to ask for approval of the minutes of the meetings of November 6th and November 12th. And I have a motion to approve.
So moved, Ebony.
Thank you. A second?
Second.
Thank you, Perry. Any edits, questions, concerns? Okay. Hearing none. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Nays? Abstentions? All right. Thank you very much. The minutes of the meetings of November 6th and November 12th are approved. This morning we have with us Dr. William Rafferty, the Senior Analyst for Knowledge Management and Public Affairs at the National Center for State Courts for a presentation. I'd like to turn the meeting over at this point to Dr. Rafferty. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you all for having me. So by way of introduction again, my name is Bill Rafter. I'm with the National Center for State Courts. A little bit of background, the National Center for State Courts was created over 50 years ago to serve as an information clearinghouse for state courts. We provide information on a whole host of issues related from obviously judicial salaries to judicial security, IT systems, courthouse construction, best practices in court management and operations. So really what we're intended to do is to provide data and information. One of our earliest publications, in fact, it is now entering its 50th year, in 1974, was something called the Survey of Judicial Salaries. And this was intended to serve as a benchmark and information sheet for state court systems regarding their salaries. Prior to that, there had been scattershot efforts at collecting judicial salaries across 50 states, DC, Puerto Rico, and the territories. Since then, we have produced this. At one point, it was on a quarterly basis. Now it is on a twice-a-year basis. Our data method is pretty straightforward. In December and in June, for January and July, we request data from all of the state court administrators in the United States, DC, Puerto Rico, and the territories regarding the judicial salaries as of January 1st or July 1st of the courts of general jurisdiction, courts of, pardon me for a second, courts of general jurisdiction, courts of intermediate appellate courts, as well as courts of last resort. So Supreme Court, Appellate Court, Superior Court in Connecticut parlance. We don't look at limited jurisdiction courts. I think that was a question that when I came here 4 years ago was asked. We don't look, for example, at Connecticut probate. There's just too much variation in terms of limited jurisdiction courts to be able to collect that data on a consistent basis. In addition, we also provide the data as a flat file, which I think the commission has, as well as with a cost of living adjustment. And that cost of living adjustment is based upon the data we receive from the Council for Community and Economic Research, C2ER, to try to adjust for the fact that it costs more in certain states to operate and function than it does in others. We do this only for the courts of general jurisdiction because, frankly, there's more of them, more judges there. But we do provide the matrix assessment points, so you could do the formula for Supreme Court, Appellate Court, and things of that nature. So this is some basic information about the National Center and about how we collect the data. Any questions at this point? Okay. So the most recent survey data, which I believe was provided, talks a little bit about here's how we adjust it out. We provide information regarding salaries at a glance, so you can look overall the mean and median, as well as the ranges for chief justices of the highest court, intermediate appellate courts. And just as a data point, I believe this was in the chief justice's an appendix to the Chief Justice's report, but this is approximately as of July 1st, 2024, where Connecticut stands. In addition, we do provide, as I mentioned, the adjustment factor, which in this case is 126.2. And so you could see approximately, when adjusted for cost of living, how Connecticut compares against the other states. I'll put a caveat here. You'll notice American Samoa and the territories aren't listed in comparison purposes. C2ER just doesn't have data for them. So for adjustment purposes, they are considered a blank. In addition, we do provide special reports, and these special reports look at specific factors related to judicial compensation and salaries. One of which, and this is obviously something we're talking before a compensation commission, is what states have compensation commissions. For example, Connecticut does. What is the source of authority? What is the information? And how do they operate and function? Additionally, we do provide a survey, which we do on about an every 4 to 5 year basis on judicial retirement plans. We do not conduct analyses on retirement plans. We simply collect the data to determine, based upon, again, the state court administrator's information about what states have judicial retirement plans, how many retirement plans. I would note that at this point, many states have as many as 2, 3, even 4 judicial retirement systems. And what are some basic data points, such as maximum amount, how much a judge has to contribute, how long does it take to vest, what is the formula calculation, et cetera, et cetera. Again, we don't do analyses to say, California's classic JRS2 is better than Arizona's Tier 2. As you can see, there's just far, far too many variables. Even just looking at the first 3 states, Alaska, the minimum amount that the judge may have to contribute could be 7. In Arizona, it could be either 7%, 12%, or 8% of their salary. California could be 8, or as high as 16% of their salary to the retirement system, but then the formula remains at 75%, or it could be a calculation formula. So it entirely depends in California about when you came into office and under what conditions. So that is, in essence, what the National Center provides. We provide the data that underlines information regarding retirement systems. The other factor we do mention, I would note it for California, forgive me, Connecticut's purpose is mandatory judicial retirement ages. That does have an impact. I know the questions come up on retirement. That does have an impact on retirement. If you can't serve forever, then you have to adjust and factor in how long can you serve for. And that is pretty much the information we have at hand. So I'm happy to take any questions from the commission.
Dr. Rafferty, is this information current to this past July of 2024?
The salary is, the retirement system isn't. We updated, the last update we did was sometime around 23. So the retirement systems, again, are a little bit outdated. We only go out into the field with that about every 4 to 5 years, and mostly because it is a voluminous ask to ask. We don't collect the data. We ask the state court administrators or the administrative offices of the courts to provide this data. It's sort of a heavy lift to ask them to give a synthesis of their entire retirement systems every year, but we do the salaries we do it twice a year. As I mentioned, we will go out into the field for judicial salaries in about 2 weeks, asking in December of 24, how much will judges make on January 1st of 2025? We do a little bit perspective because if we do it after the fact, it takes longer. It's just that way because legislatures tend to come into session in January. They have the information ready to go sometime around mid-January.
Okay. And is there any difference in your analysis between judges that are appointed versus those that are elected in terms of the salary data?
No, we've never done that analysis, but ultimately the appointment versus elective. First, I should note there's a degree of complexity there because you have in many states retention elections. Whether or not you consider that an election, you're initially appointed and then you have to go face voters on a yes or no ballot. Whether or not you consider that election is a debatable point. But we've never done an analysis about whether or not elected asterisk here, elected judges make more or less than appointed systems. Um, and ultimately, I don't necessarily know that would have an impact, mostly because a lot of the driver, and this is something we have found, is how states set judicial salaries tends to be critically important. The fact that this commission exists wouldn't have happened 25 years ago, and that is something certainly prior to the Great Recession. This was a huge issue, which is looking for consistency in increases, looking for consistency in and frankly stability in knowing there is a commission that can look at this subject versus the catch can nuances of legislatures, which I should note in many states only come into session for 30 or 60 days. So they're not a Connecticut. They're not something that is effectively, I don't want to say year round, but the legislatures had very few tools available to them, whereas a compensation commission, such as this one, allows the legislature a tool that isn't bound to that 30, 60, 90 days of session. That is a more critical component than perhaps elected versus appointed.
Thank you. Attorney Horowitz.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rafferty. Just a couple of questions. One is, do you have the capability with your data to sort so that we could just isolate New England and look at New England alone?
Yes, if you go into, I'm sorry, are you talking about salary or retirement?
Well, both. You know, they're both part of the compensation package, and I just think ultimately the data would be useful for us if we could see what's happening in our New England states.
Right. So for retirement, if you see, download the underlying data by selecting the download image and select crosstabs. So yes, it is possible to do if you download it and dump it into an Excel file. In addition, you could do it using the flat file, the information we have here. So you could very quickly download it in a similar fashion, or you could just, I mean, there's only but so many states. You could simply go into the PDF version and look at those individual states. So yes, it is possible to do.
Okay, and Karen, I assume there's somebody who can help us with that since I'm a computer Neanderthal. So
So am I. So yes, I'm sure we can find somebody who will help us with that.
all right, and then the second question I have for you, Dr. Rafferty, is does your data allow us to look at trends? I know that when I was running our law office,
Sure.
our HR person would say to us, salary increases in our industry this year are 2%, 3%, and it ended up being a good model.
Right. So in this case, if you look at salary history by state, you could, for example, this is Alabama. So this is Alabama's general jurisdiction court trend for the last, we have data going back to 1974. We publish online in this format data going back 10 years. So if you want to go back to 1974, yes, we do have that information for several years, but the ones we visualize is here. So this would be Alabama. This would be Connecticut, general, and then this would be adjusted, and then intermediate appellate court and court of last resort. So you can see the trend line. You mentioned New England states. You could throw Vermont here, for example. So yes, it is possible to do.
So just so I'm clear, if we wanted to say what over the last 2 years, what have the New England states on average done? New England states have raised their general jurisdiction judges' salaries by 2% or 3%. Can we get that, or is that We get
Yep.
the individual state data, and then we have to do the calculations ourselves.
That's correct.
This
That's
the
correct.
latter. The latter.
Yes, yeah, the latter. Yes, that is correct. So you would be able to download all of the data for 10 years for in this case Vermont. And then you would have to run the analyses for 2 years if you're only looking for 2 years against Vermont. Then do the same for Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, et cetera, et cetera. We
And
provide the raw data, and then you'd have to, I guess you'd run it 6 times.
okay. And would that be a statistically valid approach to do that, or are there statistical landmines in trying to do it that way?
I would. The reason we suggest a 10-year trend line is to avoid outliers. So one of the unfortunate circumstances that has occurred in a variety of different states, and I'm just going to pick on Alabama here for a second because it's alphabetical and it sort of demonstrates it, which is you will see some states will go for years with nothing and then suddenly spike. So if you take a 2-year data set and only look at 2 years, you may not be getting the full picture, because if they just had a massive increase, that might look a little bit different versus a 10-year trend line. And so the other peril to this is, and this is why we provide medians and means. For those of you who are going back into statistics for a minute, the mean is the average. And the reason why we hesitate sometimes to do the average is because, as I point out to my students, LeBron James and I make an average salary of $50 million. Well, LeBron James and I are only two people, and if you take our salaries and divide by two, that looks a little bit different, whereas we provide the median. And so sometimes that's a little bit better of a data point because that cuts off the outliers, right? That cuts off the massive, massive increases, and it cuts off the massive, massive decreases, and you're looking right at the median, at the middle point. But again, the recommendation is to kind of look at it as a 10-year basis in order to avoid those outliers or those spikes, if you will.
In looking, oh, sorry, Jim.
I'm good. Thank you, Karen.
Okay. In looking at Alabama, I just,
Yeah.
And we can look at this for each of the states, but 2020 and 2021 is obviously the pandemic.
Yeah. Right.
Is this something that impacts this data in terms of if other states, it looks like they cut salaries during those years.
Yeah. And let me, so Alabama is an example. I think Alaska is a better one. Let me explain. Alabama has a nuance. Alabama's entire judicial salary system was based upon longevity. So there were several judges who were part of an older system where you got automatic salary increases based upon the year, and there were a lot of retirements there. So the average collapsed because everybody retired and they went on to the new system. Alaska might be a better example. So in Alaska, you can see there was the increase, and then obviously during the pandemic, there was flat, right? And that was similar to what happened during the Great Recession. I remember testifying before this commission in 2020 and in November of 2020, and the question was, are we going to have a K-shaped recovery? And so those 2 years, there was a lot of states that just froze in place. For obvious reasons. But then since then, yeah, you see the increase. So Alabama, I should caveat, is a little bit of a nuance, but most of these other states you can see flat, flat, flat. And so this is an example I mentioned previously, looking at a 10-year pattern versus a 2-year pattern. You could be flat for several years and then spike up based upon cyclical aspects, or as I mentioned previously, there are certain states where their commission only meets every 4 years, or there is no automatic adjustment factor. Some states do have an automatic adjustment factor, in which case they'd have a more consistent increase, if you will. So, right.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Hi, this is Dan Papermaster. Are there meaningful differences related to states that have appointed judges versus elective judges?
So I think this is a form of the question was previously asked, and the answer is we have not done that analysis. What we have discovered isn't elected versus appointed. It's more of what is the mechanism by which salaries are set. So is there a commission is a critical component. Is there an automatic statutory increase? So for example, Pennsylvania automatically adjusts based on cost CPI. Whether they're elected or appointed doesn't seem to have a particular difference. As much as it is what is the mechanism by which the salary itself is set. The one other example I would provide is Arkansas, which takes the commission concept to the next level, which is the commission is binding, binding and cannot be overridden by the legislature. So every several years, there's a commission similar to this that sets salaries not just for judges but other elected officials, and whatever number they come up with is automatically appropriated. So obviously there are consistent leveling and bases for that, but the selection system itself does not, to my knowledge, has no bearing on whether or not judges do or do not have a higher level of salary.
Attorney Shepherdson, do you have a question?
No. Clear my throat, sorry.
That's okay. Are there any other questions for Dr. Rafferty?
I'm sorry, I do have another question. You mentioned that there are some states that utilize a consumer price index as part of their standard legislative scheme.
Yes.
Does your group have either any recommendation as to whether that is a good model to do that, or is there some information that you could give us as to which states are using the CPI and which states are not?
I can provide the information. We do have it in another slide. Yes, we do have, we don't make recommendations in terms of salary. It's just not something we're comfortable in doing. It's not our job and mission. We provide the data for policymakers. In terms of CPI, there are several states, and I'd be happy to provide the commission an email list. The Pennsylvania is the one that happened to be most memorable to me and happens to be the closest state that I'm aware of. Illinois does a version of this. Several other states do as well. It becomes a statutory requirement because it's in statute, and therefore there's just simply a computation that occurs every January or whenever the date is set, and then that becomes the salary point.
Thank you.
Yes, that list would be greatly appreciated, Dr. Rafferty.
Sure.
Any other questions for Dr. Rafferty? All right.
Can I just ask one more again? I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Other than CPI, are there any other standard increase models that are used by any other states?
There is one, and it's been used depending on there's been one, and that is tying it to federal judicial salaries. And the states that use that most recently, Missouri, for example, Missouri's Compensation Commission set a policy, and it was not overridden by their legislature, so it has the effect of law, that judges in Missouri make a percentage of their comparable federal counterpart. So the Missouri Supreme Court justices make, I don't know specifically, X percentage of what a U.S. Supreme Court justice makes. There they call them circuit judges. You'd call them superior. A circuit court judge shall make X percent of what a federal district court judge makes. Kansas, as of 2025, in fact, as of about 2 months from now, will be a direct tie bar state as well by statute, which means that every January 1st, the state court administrator's office will determine what is the amount that a federal judge makes, run it through a percentage formula, again, X percentage of a district court judge, and that will be the salary for Kansas district court judges, general jurisdiction court judges starting in 2025. In addition, as I mentioned, Missouri has done it by commission. When New York's Compensation Commission looked at this subject, they established for a 4-year period a similar tie bar. But that was by policy that was not overridden by the legislature rather than by statute. Kansas, I believe, at this point stands alone in a direct statutory tie bar.
Thank you.
Do you have any other research on that tie bar?
No, as I said, Kansas is unique. There are several states that have attempted it. Oregon tried to do it statutorily. New Mexico tried, but was the bill, frankly, was vetoed by the governor. to try to tie bar to federal judges. Statutorily, Kansas was the first to make that tie bar work, but not for lack of trying. I mentioned New Mexico and Oregon tried to do it statutorily.
I have one additional question, Dr. Rafferty, for myself. Does the center do any analysis of retention rates for judges?
Not to my knowledge, no. No. The only time we've looked at retention, and this is literally retention, is when judges have to face yes/no retention elections at the Supreme Court level. We do look how many judges were retained in office, and it's usually about, but that's not what you mean by retention. But that's the only thing that would even come close to retention levels. We did look at I know some states have looked at this. I would say Texas and Minnesota have looked at this, but that's a very their version of these compensation commissions have looked at that. But that is state specific, and that was created by those commissions themselves.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions from the commission members for Dr. Rafferty? Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
And appreciate it. We may be reaching out to you again for additional information, but appreciate the presentation and your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Take care. All right. Moving along to item 4 on our agenda. Or does anybody want to have any discussion about Dr. Rafferty's presentation at this point? Or save it for when we talk about work planning and that type of thing? Get a chance to digest some of the information. Does that make sense? Okay. I sent you all about 10 minutes before the meeting started the list of potential invitees for the public hearing and that have been invited in the past, and a suggestion from the judicial branch in terms of the security issue raised by, or the threat issue raised by the Chief Justice. Is there any additions to that list, or any other organizations or individuals that the commission thinks that we should hear from? And then also, is there a recommendation about the, excuse me, the Marshal Services being being issued an invitation? Yes, Attorney Ogilvy.
I noticed that the South Asian Bar Association is not on this list. I don't know if that's intentional or if they just didn't participate last time.
No, that was an error on my part when including on the list. They are on the list of invitees.
Hey, Karen, the CT Defense Lawyers Association is the same as the CT Civil Defense Lawyers Association.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. I think the official name is CT Defense Lawyers Association.
Thank you.
Although I like what you've written. Makes it clearer.
Any other thoughts? There was a question.
Are there any, I'm sorry, Karen, are there any sub-associations of the judges other than the Judges Association? Do they have any affinity groups among themselves that might be interesting for us to hear from? For example, do the minority judges have a Minority Judges Association or anything like that?
I'm not aware of that. I certainly can ask Attorney Melissa Farley to provide that information and to she's not on this today. She's watching from YouTube or whatever it is, CTN. But we can certainly follow up with her with regard to that information. There was a question as to whether or not the family support magistrates should be included in this. They're not, I mean, so that I open that for the group for discussion.
I assume they're part of our charge.
I don't believe so. But their salaries are set in part based on what the judges receive.
Oh. And it would seem to make sense to me.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
We will add them to the list.
And probate judges, are they also part of our charge?
Not to my knowledge. I think they, I will double check that, but I think they fall into that category that Dr. Rafferty talked about, which are limited jurisdiction courts.
Same for workers' comp commissioners.
As far as I'm aware, yes. And CHRO is another, the hearing officers there. Any other additions, thoughts? If you do, please feel free to email them around to the group for inclusion. And then on to item 5, which is a discussion of the charge, the factors, and our work plan. Obviously, you know, we need to hear from the people who will be attending or submitting information to the informational forum that we have in just under 2 weeks for additional information. But we have 7 of, you know, the 7 statutory factors that we need to address in our report. And I'd like to talk about how we sort of divide up the work, the various analyses that we may need to do with regard to the information that we receive and the information that's presented to us. In addition to the invited speakers, the head of the Office of Fiscal Analysis, Neil Ayers, or his, I believe his deputies, will be presenting with regard to the fiscal health of the state, we'll call it, in terms of what in collective bargaining parlance we would call the ability to pay, and what that looks like. So obviously there's more information to come for the commission. But is there anybody who wants to talk about how we, or has any ideas in terms of, other than dividing it up among the members of the commission, how we tackle these list of factors and the information and research and initial draft of the report that goes along with that?
How was it done in the past?
Yeah, that's what I was gonna ask.
Under the last commission, the members divided up the work among the members of the commission in terms of addressing each of the factors for compilation in the report. I don't know how they did it in 2016. Actually, they didn't have one in 2016 and 2012. I can check on that with the judicial branch or with legislative research. I haven't looked at the minutes from 2012, going back to 2012 to see how they accomplished that. But in 2020, they divided it up among the commission members, and individuals or pairs of individuals took on aspects of the statutory factors. We can think about that and address it on the 2nd for final, discussion as we get underway. But are there any thoughts as to how we approach that?
I just have a question. However these factors are divided up and analyzed, then after they're analyzed, they're put together. The report is actually written by a staffer, isn't it? Someone actually writes the report, I thought, from us. Is there someone who assists us with that process?
Yes.
And then what about the conclusions? I mean, we're supposed to analyze these factors, then do some sort of a presentation so everyone has the benefit. For instance, if we divide them up of all 7 areas, then we came up with the right conclusions at that point.
Yeah, and I would say our charge is to make recommendations to the legislature.
I mean, by the recommendations.
Yes. So yes, we would discuss and agree on what those recommendations should be based on the analysis of the statutory factors, and and how we weight them. Frankly, I think is one of the factors, or one of the ways we can approach it in terms of is the levels of compensation in other states and federal judges as relevant as the current inflation rate and our own state employees in terms of what we're looking at, and our own, Connecticut market. It certainly is. It's not that obviously it's a statutory factor, but how do we weigh those factors in our recommendations? I think would be part of the discussion. Is recruitment and retention become more important than it has in the past? And so that's a more important factor when we're looking at these, or informs the recommendations more than other. The diversity of the bar, or the bench, I mean, from the bar.
It may be best to take a look at those factors and let us sort of think a bit, I think, a little bit about what areas we might be most productive in and be willing to spend some time analyzing, maybe discuss that in a second, unless we have to do that today. I suppose we.
No, we don't, but I do want, I think we should start thinking about it because we have to do this in January. So
Is that when our report is due?
Pardon?
Was our report due the 1st of January?
I should have that in my head. Hang on. Let me pull up the statute.
Karen, it's the report is due no later than January 2nd.
Yeah, okay. That's what I thought. That's usually when legislatures require reports to be done.
Karen,
I was wondering the same thing, because based off of the presentation, I guess the most updated data from the seems to be mid-January. He was saying that I guess they send out the collection. So I guess we'll, be working off of the data that we have, but I was just thinking about that from a timing standpoint. But of course, if that's what the statute requires, that's what the statute requires. But it seems as if they were going to be getting the most updated information was going to be reported out kind of mid-January.
And I would agree with you, Dean Nelson, and I think in part that's Connecticut is, I think it's based, if I were to guess without asking Dr. Rafferty, that is that each state may have different budgeting times and when these increases typically come into play. For us, it has been July. So you're right, we may not have all of the most recent data from the states, but at least it's current to 2024. And would have captured Connecticut's most recent increase to its judiciary.
Right.
Yes, Attorney Ogilvy.
So Karen, and I think I remember, did you say we were going to try and get our report done before the holidays? Was that our goal?
That's our goal.
Okay.
And so the 7 factors are both included in Justice Mullen's report to us, or presentation to us, as well as the presentation from the Office of Legislative Research that we had at the start of this. And they include, the other states and federal judges, inflation rate, what other state employees have gotten in the applicable fiscal years, what attorneys are being compensated by government agencies, academic institutions, private and nonprofit organizations, the state's overall economic climate, again, attracting highly qualified and experienced attorneys, and the state's ability to fund the increases are the 7 factors.
Karen, will we have some speakers, somebody addressing us who will be able to answer all 7 of those, or 6, all of those questions, so that somebody who can answer those questions for us?
I think it's going to be a combination of those things from the various speakers. So I don't know that the speakers may address each of the factors. You know, we're including that in the invitation to them. But for instance, I'm not sure that they would be able to address the ability to fund compensation increases. That's where we would rely on the Office of Fiscal Analysis to provide us that information.
Oh, I see. We still have in our back pocket the Office of Fiscal Analysis who can give us the information as to what is the inflation rate, what is the average attorney compensation in Connecticut, et cetera.
Yes. And then in terms of what our overall economic climate is, I believe mid-November, they were required to come up with consensus revenues. They do it again in January and then in April, which that won't help us, but the most recent consensus revenue report, which would have been, I think, November 15th or 17th, is the Comptroller's Office, the Office of Policy and Management, and the Office of Fiscal Analysis sort of all coming together and saying, yes, this is what we all agree the future looks like for the next period of time.
And is that, would all that information be presented to us by way of a report, or is that somebody who would come speak to us on December 2nd and say, answer these economic questions for us?
They are going to speak to us on December 2nd, and so they are prepared to answer those, or at least the factors, or the state's ability to pay type of thing. With regard to questions that we have, if we know in advance that we want them to answer certain questions, please share those, or questions that you have that you think they should be providing us information on. We can give those to them in advance so they're prepared.
Karen, I'm just looking at the 2020 report, and there is quite detailed economic information in here, and there's references to an OFA report, and that may be to some other report that OFA did. But if OFA did a report to the commission last time, I think we should find that out, and if they did, I think we should request it so that we have something in writing from them.
That's a good idea.
Will do.
And I guess more generally, if there were, and I don't know if maybe Melissa or Kat would know this, but if there are other sort of written submissions by way of reports that were relied on last time, it would be good to kind of have the whole universe of that repeated.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe one other question, just and this may be for others or maybe for the speakers, but I don't know if anyone has heard anecdotally any kind of feedback on the format or the weighting from 2020. I mean, has there been grumbling or affirmation of how that was done?
I have not heard anything from my perspective. Others?
I certainly haven't either.
Any other further discussion on this? All right, so I will reach out to OFA and get the report from last time, and have Kat double check with them in terms of if they're preparing a report similarly for us, or if it's one of their standard reports, which case we can get that in advance, and it may help to formulate questions for OFA when they're before us. I'm certainly happy to provide the consensus revenue information. Despite working for both the state comptroller and the Office of Policy and Management, I'm not sure that I'm as able to read those reports as I should be, but but I will certainly get that and forward that along. And then each month they do what they call the letter of the first, which talks about just about the current fiscal year. It may be helpful to the commission members if there's something in that report that comes out on December 1st that signals, any kind of fiscal outcome that other than the current fiscal year in terms of weakness in any particular sector for revenue that may be a source of questions for the commission members. And And then whether or not there are any subunits of the judiciary that we should be asking affinity organizations within the judiciary, and anything else that I missed in terms of what we're looking for. All right. Any other thoughts, questions, issues before we move to adjourn? All right. Thank you all very much. May I have a motion to
you.
adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Bye.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a
Have a good
nice
day.
weekend if I don't talk to you, and a nice holiday.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.